Hello everyone, Dark of all Trades here. So it has been a while since I've come across any new arguments for the existence of a god. I'm sure you all have been waiting as well. Well, good news, I seem to have found one. Finally, something new I can sink my teeth into. With a brief search, I have also not seen a single other person take on this argument, so that means I am likely the first, at least openly taking on this argument and critiquing it. Could this be an argument that convinces me and the rest of the world that a god exists? Well, probably not, but it could convince someone. And who is that someone? Well, the channel I found this on is called Geomikpri Mizrani. I don't know what that means either. So what is the argument? It is the title of his video, The Tautology or Semantic Argument for God's Existence. Now, I've never heard anything about this argument, but even putting all of my experience dealing with apologetics aside, I am immediately skeptical that it will be any good based on the title alone. No shade to this guy by any means. Putting your thoughts into a video and posting it for the world to see can be a pretty big scary thing. With only 206 views, I can see why not many people will have heard of the argument from him. Maybe he'll talk about where it came from, but I did some preliminary research and couldn't find much of anything. The closest thing I could find is some strange argument from a Dutch philosopher named Emmanuel Rutten in 2021 called The Semantic Argument Against the Existence of Universally Held Real Properties. I found his paper on this, and it is not an exciting read. But go read it if you really want to. However, I'm not here to talk about that paper. I'm here for the new argument. It is important that I go into what a tautology is briefly. Specifically in logic, a tautology is a statement that is true by virtue of its logical form alone. That means that it is an expression that is always true regardless of the truth values of its individual components. It is true by its very structure. For example, if I say a square has 4 sides and 4 right angles, the word square necessitates the fact that it has 4 sides and 4 right angles. The very nature of the term square implies these characteristics, making the statement logically true by its structure. In other words, the truth of the statement is guaranteed by the meaning of the words used. Tautologies are often used in logic and mathematics and are characterized by the fact that they provide no new information. With that out of the way, let's turn to Geo. I'm going to call him Geo, and see what he has to say.
The tautological argument is an argument around two premises with a theism-affirming conclusion. The first premises is, if the nature of reality is such that God can be described with a tautology, then God must necessarily exist.
Okay, we have a first premise, and already we have a problem. This argument is supposed to demonstrate that God exists. The first premise is an excellent example of circular reasoning, which one would think is a bad thing, and one would be right. The premise is written in a way that tries to hide its circularity. While the structure may give the appearance of presenting a conditional relationship between the nature of reality and the existence of God, upon closer examination, the very definition of God is used to smuggle in the conclusion that God necessarily exists. This creates a circular reasoning where the conclusion is embedded within the premise. Just within the first premise, we have a logical fallacy, and that is impressive. Just in case that isn't enough, there are some minor issues with this premise as well. The phrase nature of reality is quite vague, and could be interpreted in various ways. The argument doesn't clearly define or specify what is meant by the nature of reality, making it difficult to assess the soundness of this premise. Without a precise definition, the argument lacks clarity and specificity. Further, the premise assumes that the nature of reality can allow for the tautological description of God that necessitates its existence. This assumption seems to be defining God into existence by incorporating existence into the very definition of God. If the definition itself contains the idea of existence, it is considered a weak foundation for proving God's existence. So 3 issues right off the bat. What's the second premise?
The second premise is the nature of reality is such that God can be described by a tautology.
Is it really? This premise has some of the same issues and introduces a different set of issues. Similar to the first premise, the term nature of reality is not precisely defined. This lack of clarity does make it difficult to evaluate the truth or falsity of the premise. A more precise definition of this term would strengthen this argument. The premise asserts a specific quality of the nature of reality, namely that it allows God to be described by a tautology. However, the argument doesn't provide any demonstration or evidence to support this claim. Without support for this premise, the overall argument severely lacks a strong foundation. Like the first premise, there is an issue with assuming existence in the definition of God. If the premise suggests that the nature of reality allows for a tautological description of God, it implicitly incorporates the idea of God's existence into the definition itself. Finally, the premise assumes a level of specificity regarding how God can be described by a tautology without providing concrete examples or criteria. Description of God can vary widely among different belief systems, making the premise susceptible to subjective interpretations.
What that means, a tautology, is a sentence that is just true by its own meaning. For example, no bachelors are married. It's just because bachelors are unmarried. So a tautology that describes God could be, if the answer to the question, what is God, could be something like, that arbiter of truth without which no propositions could be true or false.
I just talked in depth about the issues in this in premise 2, but using this meaning for God brings up even more issues. The definition is vague, lacking in specificity. What does it mean for God to be the arbiter of truth? How does God fulfill this role? The lack of concrete details leaves this definition open to various interpretations. This definition also introduces epistemic challenges regarding the nature of truth and propositions. The claim that no propositions could be true or false without God raises questions about the nature of truth and whether it is contingent upon a divine entity. This definition implies an external source, God, determining the truth of propositions. This idea raises questions about the subjectivity of truth and whether it can be objectively determined by an external arbiter. Lastly, for this, it presupposes a particular philosophical perspective on truth, propositions, and the role of the divine being. Different philosophical traditions may challenge or provide alternative perspectives on these concepts. I could go into more, but there's no need to beat a dead horse.
Well, if that proposition is true or false, then there must be that arbiter of truth without which no propositions could be true or false. Or another one could be, what is God? God is that without which nothing that is could be.
This definition suffers from effectively the same problems as the previous definition, so I'm not going to go too much into it. It does add one thing. The definition has a tautological structure as it defines God in terms of existence. This tautology is problematic when attempting to demonstrate or argue the existence of God, as it presupposes what it aims to prove. It also brings up challenges related to existence and how God is linked to the existence of everything, raising questions about how we come or could possibly come to know or understand the relationship between God and this existence. I said I wasn't going to go into this one, so I'll just leave it there.
If anything is, including that definition, then it necessitates the existence of that without which nothing that is could be. So the conclusion is the nature of reality is such that God must necessarily exist.
Finally, the therefore God part. I'll break it all down at the end.
Now, some people accuse the ontological argument, which is a similar argument.
I don't want to go heavily into the ontological argument. If there is interest, I'll make a standalone video for it, but it basically looks like this. Comparing these two arguments, there are some similarities. Both arguments operate at a conceptual or abstract level, dealing with the nature of God and reality. They both involve defining God in a specific way and drawing conclusions about God's existence based on those definitions. There's also a shared emphasis on conceptual reasoning and the attempt to derive the existence of God through abstract considerations rather than empirical evidence. I would argue that there are likely more differences than similarities, but that might not be important here.
They accuse the ontological argument of defining God into existence. What the tautological argument does is it says, if the nature of reality is such that God can be defined into existence by a tautology, mind you,
it can't. Definitions play a role in understanding concepts. The notion of defining something into existence faces too many challenges in terms of logical rigor and empirical justification. The example I've heard before is called a realicorn. A realicorn is defined as a unicorn, but one that exists in reality. Simply by adding exists in reality to the definition does not mean a realicorn actually exists in reality.
If God can be defined into existence by a tautology, then God necessarily exists, at least insofar as that tautology describes him.
On top of the myriad of issues that I've already brought up, this statement relies on the idea that a tautology can bring something into existence. As I said at the beginning, tautologies by their nature are true by virtue of their logical form, but they do not create or establish the existence of entities in the external world.
If you want to explore attacking the first premise, you would have to play with the idea that the nature of reality is such that God can be described by a tautology, but that the tautology would be false.
I've already shown the issues in the first premise, though his language here makes it seem like there's only one way to attack the premise. I don't think so. I question the clarity and coherence of the proposed tautology that describes God. We would need to address whether the concept of God can be adequately captured by a tautology without oversimplifying or distorting the traditional theological understanding. There is a diversity of conceptualizations of God across different religions and philosophical traditions. I would argue that the first premise assumes a specific understanding of God, and I challenge whether this understanding is universally applicable. Closest to my area of expertise, I have to point out the limitations of human language in even possibly describing the divine. Even a Christian could argue that the nature of God, being transcendent and beyond human comprehension, might defy straightforward linguistic representation, including tautological descriptions. Lastly, for this part, I must emphasize the humility inherent in acknowledging the limitations of human knowledge. I suggested throughout this that the nature of reality, especially concerning divine matters, might be beyond our full grasp, making a single tautological description questionable.
And I don't see how that would work because the negation of a tautology is a logical contradiction.
Well, at least Geo got something right.
Now, this is not a knockdown argument.
This isn't even a good argument.
I mean, each of those two premises could be a whole little debate on their own. But to me, it just sort of seems obvious, prima facie, just at first glance, on the face of it, it seems obvious to me that both of those premises are true. So it seems obvious to me that God must necessarily exist.
It seems obvious that this argument is true if you don't think about it for a moment and just accept it, or if you start by accepting the conclusion. Your task today is to put in the comments why someone would accept this argument, but be nice. And that's the end of his video. So let's take a look at the entire argument as a whole and what the issues are. Premise 1. If the nature of reality is such that God can be described with a tautology, then God must necessarily exist. Premise 2. The nature of reality is such that God can be described by a tautology. Conclusion. Therefore, the nature of reality is such that God must necessarily exist. Here are the main issues I noticed. The argument is tautological in nature. It defines God's existence based on the premise that if God can be described with a tautology, then God must necessarily exist. This is a circular argument as it already assumes the conclusion in its premises. The terms nature of reality and God can be described with a tautology are quite ambiguous. The argument doesn't provide clear definitions or criteria for these terms, making it difficult to assess the soundness of the premises. Similar to the ontological argument, there is a potential issue with assuming existence in the definition of God. If the definition itself involves existence, e.g. arbiter of truth without which no propositions could be true or false, it is defining God into existence. The argument concludes that God must necessarily exist based on premises that are not conclusively demonstrated. The argument could be seen as making a leap from the nature of reality being describable by tautology to the necessary existence of God without providing sufficient evidence for that claim. The argument lacks support or evidence for the true premises. Geo even admits that they can be argued against. It assumes the nature of reality can be described by a tautology without demonstrating why this is the case. As a bonus problem, Geo mentions that the argument seems obvious, prima facie at first glance, relying on intuition rather than providing rigorous logical support. Overall, this was not even a challenging argument. It seems to hide behind philosophical language so it could sound more convincing to people who don't look too closely. But any amount of scrutiny and it just falls apart, just like every other argument for God. If one can define a God into existence, then I can define a God out of existence. That's it for this one. So what did you think? Do you think that this argument provides some convincing points? Or do you think both the premises and the conclusion are entirely unwarranted? Let me know in the comments below. If the nature of reality is such that you like this, hit the like button. However, if you want to subscribe or want to have already subscribed, then tautologically hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Though I need to give a special thanks to my patrons, Calamitous Anima, Sora, Long-Haired Lefty, Musical Ocelot, Ooga Booga Luga, Tarek Alkasab, Jamminbomb, Kai Henningsen, and Triple Towel, who are the patrons who patronly subscribe to my Patreon. If you'd like to exist as a tautology, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/darkofalltrades. Every single one of you help encourage me to sit through these arguments like this and not go absolutely batty. Thank you all so much. And as always, keep learning.